In the state of Karnataka in southern India, on the banks of the Tungabhadra River where the river bends through a landscape of extraordinary granite boulders, there is a place called Hampi. The boulders here are unlike anything in the surrounding landscape. Enormous, rounded, balanced on each other in formations that seem too precarious to be stable, colored in shades of gray and orange and pink, scattered across the plains and the riverbanks and the low hills in a density that gives the landscape a quality both prehistoric and dreamlike. The river runs through this boulder field in curves and pools that catch the light differently at different hours of the day, and the vegetation that grows between the rocks and along the riverbanks, the palms and the banana plants and the scrub forest of the Deccan, gives the whole scene a specific lushness that contrasts with the hardness of the granite. In this landscape, beginning in the 14th century and expanding through the 15th and into the early 16th, a civilization built one of the largest cities in the world. At its height in the reign of Krishna Devraya, who ruled from 1509 to 1529, Hampi was the capital of the Vijayanagara Empire, a state that controlled most of peninsular India south of the Deccan Plateau, and the city itself may have housed between 300,000 and 500,000 people, making it one of the 5 or 6 largest cities on Earth at a time when London had perhaps 50,000 inhabitants. The scale of the city, visible in the 26 square kilometers of ruins that extend across the boulder landscape today, gives the modern visitor an immediate and visceral sense of the ambition and the organizational capacity of the civilization that built it. In 1565, a coalition of the 5 Deccan sultanates that bordered the Vijayanagara Empire to the north formed an alliance against the empire and met its army at the Battle of Talikota. The battle was decisive. The Vijayanagara army was routed, the emperor fled, and the coalition forces moved south to the capital. What followed was a campaign of destruction that lasted, according to the chronicles, for several months. The temples were attacked, the royal palaces were burned, the bazaars were looted and demolished, and the population fled. When the destruction was complete, the city was abandoned. The Vijayanagara Empire continued in a reduced form with its capital elsewhere, but Hampi itself was never rebuilt. The jungle grew back over the ruins of the bazaars and the palaces, and the enormous granite temples, too massive and too solidly built to be easily demolished, remained standing in the landscape, gradually becoming the home of new communities of pilgrims and priests who maintained the sacred functions of the temple complex even as the imperial city around them disappeared into the undergrowth. The specific quality of Hampi as it exists today, the combination of massive and elaborately carved stone temples with the wild granite boulder landscape and the subtropical vegetation and the slow-moving river, is one that is unlike any other archaeological site in the world. The temples and the ruins are not in a desert or a plain where the ancient architecture is the primary visual element, but in a living landscape that has grown up around them and through them, so that the line between the ancient and the natural is constantly shifting. A carved stone elephant looks out from a temple wall over a grove of banana plants. A ruined aqueduct curves through a field of boulders the size of houses. A gopuram, a towered temple gateway, rises above the tree line against a sky that is the specific luminous blue of the southern Indian dry season. Hampi is a ruin in a landscape, and the landscape is as much a part of the experience as the ruins. The specific history of the name Hampi is itself a small window into the layered history of the site. The name derives from Pampa, an ancient name for the Tungabhadra River, which in turn is the name of a goddess associated with the river in the local tradition. The Vijayanagara city was known in its own time by several names, including Vijayanagara, meaning city of victory, and Vidyanagara, meaning city of knowledge, but the name Hampi, derived from the ancient sacred name of the river, persisted in local usage and was eventually adopted as the standard designation for the site in the modern period. This small linguistic history reflects the deeper continuity between the pre-Vijayanagara sacred traditions of the Tungabhadra Valley and the imperial civilization that chose this place for its capital. The visitors who come to Hampi today encounter a landscape that has been shaped by both the Vijayanagara builders and by the 5 centuries of natural and human processes that have worked on the ruins since the destruction of the city. The banyan trees that have grown through the walls of some of the smaller structures, their roots penetrating the stone and slowly pulling the masonry apart, are a visible reminder of the ongoing contest between the biological and the architectural at an unmanaged ruin. The agricultural fields that have reclaimed large areas of the ancient urban landscape speak to the continuing productivity of the Tungabhadra Valley soil that made the site an attractive location for settlement in the first place. And the thriving pilgrimage economy of the Virupaksha temple complex shows that the sacred energy of the place has not diminished with the fall of the empire that did so much to amplify it. The Vijayanagara Empire that built Hampi was one of the most significant political and cultural formations of medieval South Asia, and its specific character, the traditions it drew on, the challenges it faced, and the specific form of civilization it produced, are essential context for understanding the city that was its capital. The empire was founded in 1336, according to the traditional dating, by two brothers, Harihara and Bukka, who established a state in the Tungabhadra Valley as a Hindu counterweight to the Muslim sultanates that had been expanding southward through the Deccan. The specific religious dimension of the Vijayanagara state was central to its self-understanding and to its legitimacy. The empire presented itself as the defender of the Hindu tradition against the encroachments of Muslim power, and this self-presentation was central to the specific form of royal ideology that the empire developed and that is visible throughout the monumental architecture of Hampi. The religious tradition that the Vijayanagara rulers patronized was primarily Shaivite, devoted to Shiva and to the related deity Virupaksha, who was specifically associated with the Hampi site and who is represented by the Virupaksha temple that remains one of the most important active religious centers in Karnataka to this day. But the Vijayanagara rulers also patronized Vaishnavism, the tradition devoted to Vishnu, and Jainism, and the specific religious pluralism visible in the temple landscape of Hampi, which encompasses structures from all these traditions, reflects the broadly tolerant approach to religious diversity that characterized the Vijayanagara state at its best. The political and military history of the Vijayanagara Empire was one of almost continuous conflict with the Deccan sultanates to the north, and the specific character of this conflict shaped the military architecture, the administrative system, and the economic organization of the empire in ways visible throughout the Hampi landscape. The great walls and bastions that surrounded the urban core of Hampi, substantial remains of which survive today, reflect the empire's awareness of its vulnerability to the northern powers and its investment in the physical defenses of its capital. The administrative quarters of the city, with their stepped tanks, their audience halls, and their elephant stables, reflect the organizational demands of maintaining an empire that at its height extended across the entire southern tip of the Indian subcontinent. The specific political achievement of the Vijayanagara Empire was to maintain, for more than 2 centuries, a Hindu state capable of withstanding the military pressure of some of the most powerful sultanates of medieval India. The founders of the empire made a deliberate decision to locate their capital in a landscape that combined natural defensive advantages with sacred significance, and the choice of the Tungabhadra boulder landscape was wise from both perspectives. The boulders provided a natural obstacle to cavalry-based attack, while the sacred traditions of the Tungabhadra Valley gave the new capital a religious legitimacy that connected the imperial project to the ancient devotional traditions of the region. The administrative system of the Vijayanagara Empire was organized around a system of nayakas, or governors, who administered the different regions of the empire under the authority of the central crown. The Nayaka system allowed the empire to integrate diverse regional traditions and local elites into the imperial framework while maintaining the central authority of the Vijayanagara kings. The specific tensions between the central crown and the regional Nayakas, which became increasingly significant in the later period of the empire as the power of the center weakened, were one of the structural vulnerabilities that contributed to the ultimate defeat at Talikota, where the loyalty of some of the Nayaka commanders was not as firm as the imperial leadership may have assumed. The specific combination of Hindu kingship ideology and South Indian architectural tradition that the Vijayanagara rulers developed was not simply a defensive reaction to Muslim power, but a creative synthesis that produced some of the most extraordinary cultural achievements of medieval India. The temple building program of the Vijayanagara rulers, which transformed the sacred landscape of the Tungabhadra Valley over 2 centuries, was a form of devotional expression as well as political statement, and the specific religious beliefs of the rulers, their personal devotion to Virupaksh, to Rama, to Vithala, shaped the specific character of the buildings they patronized in ways that go beyond the purely political or aesthetic. The economic success that made the Vijayanagara building program possible was built on the foundations of a productive agricultural economy, supported by the extensive irrigation infrastructure of the Tungabhadra Valley, and an active commercial economy, sustained by the empire's position at the center of the Indian Ocean trading system. The specific combination of agricultural wealth and commercial prosperity that characterized the Vijayanagara state at its height was unusual in the medieval world and accounts for both the scale of the city that the empire was able to build and maintain and the devastating impact of the disruption of that economy in the aftermath of the 1565 destruction. The architecture of Hampi is one of the most extensive and most varied bodies of medieval Indian temple architecture surviving anywhere on the subcontinent, and its specific character, the scale and complexity of the temple complexes, the distinctive Vijayanagara sculptural style, and the relationship between the built environment and the natural landscape, reflects the specific aesthetic and religious vision of the civilization that produced it. The dominant architectural tradition at Hampi is the Dravidian style, the South Indian temple architecture tradition that developed over more than 1,000 years from the earlier traditions of the Pallava and Chola kingdoms, and that is characterized by the distinctive tiered towers known as gopurams that mark the entrances to temple enclosures. The Vijayanagara architects brought this tradition to a new scale and a new elaborateness, adding multiple enclosure walls to the major temples, constructing colonnaded mandapas or pillared halls of extraordinary scale and ambition, and covering the surfaces of their buildings with a density of sculptural decoration that reflects both the wealth of the state at its height and the high level of craftsmanship available to its builders. The Virupaksh temple, which has been in continuous use for religious worship since at least the 7th century CE and which the Vijayanagara rulers expanded into one of the largest temple complexes in southern India, is the oldest and most continuously inhabited of the major Hampi monuments. Its principal gopuram, rising approximately 50 meters above the main entrance, is one of the landmarks of the Hampi landscape, visible from many points across the site. The inner sanctum of the temple, where the Virupaksh lingam is housed, is one of the most sacred sites in Karnataka, and the continuous tradition of worship at this site, which survived the destruction of 1565 and has continued without interruption to the present day, gives the Virupaksh complex a living quality that distinguishes it from the other Hampi monuments, most of which are maintained as archaeological sites rather than active places of worship. The Vithala temple, which most art historians consider the supreme achievement of Vijayanagara architecture, was built primarily in the 15th and early 16th centuries and represents the fullest expression of the Vijayanagara architectural ambition. Its principal attraction is the pillared mandapa known as the musical pillars hall, whose columns, when struck, produce different musical tones as a result of their specific stone composition and dimensions. The stone chariot in the Vithala temple courtyard, a sculpture of a temple car with rotating wheels, is one of the most photographed monuments in India and one of the most immediately recognizable images of the Hampi site. The Narasimha monolith, a single granite boulder carved into the figure of the man-lion avatar of Vishnu, is one of the most dramatic sculptures at Hampi and one that illustrates both the scale of the Vijayanagara sculptural ambition and the specific damage inflicted on the site during the destruction of 1565. The figure, approximately 7 meters high, was originally accompanied by a female figure in its lap whose traces are still visible on the stone, and it was housed within a mandapa or pillared hall that was completely destroyed during the destruction campaign. The Narasimha now sits in the open, exposed to the elements, with the damage to its lower portions from the 1565 destruction still clearly visible, a particularly direct reminder of the violence of the site's end. The stepped tanks and water management features within the temple enclosures at Hampi are among the most sophisticated hydraulic engineering features surviving from the medieval South Asian world. The large tank within the Vittala temple complex, for example, was not simply a decorative feature but a functional element in the ritual economy of the temple, providing water for the ritual bathing of the deity's image and for the ablutions of the priests and pilgrims. The specific engineering of the stepped tanks, with their precise geometry and their stone-lined walls, reflects the high level of craft skill available to the Vijayanagara builders and the importance they attach to the management of water within the temple complex. The specific engineering achievements of the Vijayanagara water management system extend beyond the temple complexes to the broader urban landscape of Hampi and the surrounding agricultural territory. The network of channels and aqueducts that distributed the water of the Tungabhadra River across the agricultural land of the Hampi Basin was one of the foundations of the city's food supply, and the maintenance of this agricultural infrastructure was as essential to the city's functioning as the maintenance of the temple complexes. The specific remains of the Vijayanagara irrigation system, including the large tank at Kamalapura on the eastern edge of the site and the numerous smaller tanks and channels that are scattered across the landscape, document an investment in agricultural water management that reflects both the engineering capacity of the Vijayanagara state and the fundamental importance of reliable food production to the functioning of a city of this scale. The comparison of the Hampi water management system with the irrigation engineering of other great medieval cities, including the hydraulic engineering of Angkor Wat in Cambodia and the canal systems of the medieval Islamic cities of the Middle East, illuminates both the specific achievements of the Vijayanagara engineers and the broader context of medieval hydraulic engineering in the tropical and subtropical world. The specific solutions developed by the Vijayanagara builders for managing water in a landscape of granite bedrock and variable rainfall reflect both local ingenuity and a knowledge of hydraulic engineering principles that was shared, in different forms, by the advanced hydraulic civilizations of the medieval world. The economy of Hampi and the Vijayanagara Empire was one of the most sophisticated and most extensively documented commercial systems of medieval South Asia, and the specific character of the city as a center of trade as well as of religious and political authority gives the Hampi ruins a dimension that purely religious or military sites lack. The bazaars of Hampi, of which the most famous was the Hampi Bazaar that led from the main gateway of the Virupaksha temple complex, were centers of the most important luxury trade of the medieval Indian Ocean world. The Portuguese traveler Domingo Paes, who visited Hampi in the 1520s, described a market so large and so richly stocked that it seemed to him like the markets of Lisbon, the most cosmopolitan city of early 16th century Europe. He described merchants from many different parts of the world, goods from across the Indian Ocean trade network, and a commercial activity whose scale and diversity reflected the empire's position at the center of the most active maritime trading system in the world of its time. The specific goods that moved through the Hampi bazaars illustrate the empire's position in the global economy of the 15th and 16th centuries. Horses were imported from Arabia and Persia in large numbers, because the Deccan was not suitable for horse breeding and the military requirement for cavalry was constant and pressing. Elephants were imported from the forests of the eastern coast of the subcontinent and trained for both military and ceremonial use. Diamonds from the Golconda mines of the northern Deccan, which were the world's primary source of diamonds before the discovery of South African deposits, passed through Hampi on their way to the markets of the Middle East and Europe. Spices from the Malabar coast, textiles from the looms of the Coromandel coast, and the products of the empire's own agricultural and craft economy all converged in the bazaars of the capital. The specific relationship between the Vijayanagara Empire and the Portuguese presence on the Malabar and Coromandel coasts, established by the Portuguese conquest of Goa in 1510 and their subsequent dominance of the Indian Ocean trade, is one of the more interesting dimensions of the late Vijayanagara period. The Portuguese and the Vijayanagara state were natural allies against their common enemy, the Muslim Deccan sultanates, and the alliance between them produced a specific flow of trade, military technology, and cultural influence that shaped the late Vijayanagara state in ways still visible in the Hampi ruins. The Portuguese supplied firearms and horses in exchange for spices and textiles, and the relationship between the two powers was one of mutual commercial and military convenience that lasted until the fall of the empire in 1565. The specific role of horses in the Vijayanagara economy deserves particular attention because it illuminates a fundamental structural feature of the empire's political economy. Unlike the northern Indian empires that could breed horses on the Indo-Gangetic plains, the Vijayanagara state was dependent on the import of military horses from Arabia and Persia, and this dependency made the empire permanently vulnerable to disruptions in the supply chain. The Portuguese monopoly on the horse trade after 1510 gave them significant leverage over the Vijayanagara state, and the specific terms of the horse trade were a major factor in the Portuguese-Vijayanagara relationship. The scale of the horse import is documented in the traveler accounts, which describe thousands of horses arriving at the port of Goa annually and being transported overland to the Vijayanagara capital. The diamond trade that flowed through Hampi is one of the more remarkable aspects of the city's commercial history. The Golconda diamond mines in the northern Deccan, which were the world's primary source of diamonds from the medieval period until the discovery of South African deposits in the 19th century, produced the stones that became famous in the European courts as the Koh-i-Noor, the Hope Diamond, and the other legendary stones of the early modern period. The trade route that brought these stones from the mines to the European market passed through the bazaars of Hampi and the ports of the Vijayanagara coast, and the specific role of Vijayanagara merchants and state officials in managing this trade was one of the more lucrative dimensions of the empire's commercial economy. The wealth generated by the diamond trade, combined with the revenues from the horse import trade and the spice export trade, gave the Vijayanagara state resources that were very large by the standards of the medieval world and that funded both the extraordinary building program at Hampi and the military forces that protected the empire's territory for more than 2 centuries. The fall of the city in 1565 brought all of this to an abrupt end, and the specific commercial networks that had converged on Hampi were disrupted or redirected in ways that had lasting effects on the economic geography of peninsular India. The ports of the Malabar and Coromandel coasts that had been integrated into the Vijayanagara commercial system continued to function under new political arrangements, but the specific concentration of commercial wealth and activity at Hampi that had made it one of the world's great cities was not replicated elsewhere. The economic momentum of the Vijayanagara commercial system dissipated across the successor states and the colonial commercial structures that were beginning to take shape along the Indian coasts in the same period. The daily life of Hampi at its height, as recoverable from the chronicles and traveler accounts and from the physical evidence of the city's infrastructure, was that of a major medieval South Asian metropolis, complex and varied and organized to support the functions of both an imperial capital and a major religious center. The water management infrastructure of Hampi was one of the great engineering achievements of the Vijayanagara state. The city's builders constructed an elaborate system of aqueducts, canals, and steppe tanks that captured and distributed the water of the Tungabhadra River and its tributaries across the urban landscape, supporting both the agricultural production of the surrounding countryside and the specific water needs of the temples, the palaces, and the residential areas of the city. The royal enclosure at the center of the city was particularly well supplied with water, with multiple tanks and bathing platforms and a sophisticated drainage system whose remains are still visible in the excavated areas of the site. The Queen's Bath, one of the most elegant of the Hampi royal monuments, is a rectangular tank enclosed within a 2-story building whose arched verandas, in a style that shows clear Islamic architectural influence, surround the bathing pool on all sides. The specific combination of Hindu and Islamic architectural elements in the Queen's Bath is characteristic of the late Vijayanagara architectural tradition, which absorbed and integrated influences from the Muslim Deccan sultanates that were its primary rivals, producing a syncretic architectural style that is one of the distinctive achievements of the period. The elephant stables, a row of 11 chambers with alternating Hindu and Islamic architectural forms, were designed to house the royal war elephants that were both the primary heavy weapon of the Vijayanagara army and important symbols of royal power and prestige. The specific care invested in the architecture of the elephant stables, which are among the most elaborate animal housing facilities surviving from the medieval world, reflects the importance of war elephants in the military and ceremonial life of the Vijayanagara state and the specific symbolic weight attached to their keeping. The Zenana enclosure within the royal area of Hampi, The walled precinct that housed the women of the royal household is one of the most extensively studied areas of the site from the perspective of social history. The specific architecture of the zenana, with its multiple gateways, its watchtowers, its gardens and tanks, and its residential structures, reflects the specific social organization of the Vijayanagara royal household and the particular importance attached to the security and comfort of the royal women. The accounts of foreign visitors who were permitted limited access to the zenana describe a world of considerable luxury and sophistication, with elaborately dressed women, fine textiles, and a domestic economy organized around the service of the royal household. The royal stables at Hampi are not to be confused with the elephant stables. These were the facilities for the horses that were the primary mobile striking force of the Vijayanagara army. The physical remains of the horse stables are less well preserved than those of the elephant stables, reflecting perhaps the more functional and less ceremonially significant character of horse keeping compared with elephant keeping in the Vijayanagara hierarchical imagination. But the scale of the horse-keeping facilities documented in the written sources suggests that the royal stables were a substantial part of the infrastructure of the Hampi military complex. The specific military technology of the Vijayanagara state was a sophisticated combination of traditional South Asian military practice and the innovations imported from the Muslim sultanates to the north and from the Portuguese on the coast. The Vijayanagara army maintained a large corps of war elephants, which were the most powerful military technology available to South Asian states before the widespread adoption of firearms, and supplemented them with cavalry, infantry, and the artillery and musket-armed units that were the product of the military technology exchange with the Portuguese and the Deccan states. The fortification of Hampi itself was an extraordinary engineering undertaking. The city walls, which enclosed the urban core of Hampi in a circuit of several dozen kilometers, were built of massive granite blocks fitted together without mortar in the traditional South Indian drystone tradition. The walls were reinforced at regular intervals by bastions and watchtowers, and the main gates of the city were elaborate multi-story structures with specific defensive features, including choke points and sally ports that reflect the sophisticated military thinking of the Vijayanagara military engineers. The specific extent and character of the Hampi fortifications, which are still partially traceable in the landscape even where the walls themselves have collapsed, document a defensive investment on a scale appropriate to one of the most important cities of the medieval world. The Battle of Talikota in January 1565 and the subsequent destruction of Hampi represent one of the most dramatic episodes of urban destruction in the history of South Asia, and the specific circumstances of the battle and its aftermath illuminate both the political dynamics of the Deccan and the specific vulnerabilities of the Vijayanagara state. The battle was the culmination of decades of conflict between the Vijayanagara Empire and the 5 Deccan sultanates of Bijapur, Ahmadnagar, Bidar, Berar, and Golconda. The specific trigger for the alliance that brought the sultanates together against Vijayanagara is debated by historians, but the general background was the continuing competition for territory and resources that had characterized the relationship between the empire and its northern neighbors since the foundation of the sultanates in the 15th century. The alliance of 1565 was the first time that all 5 sultanates had cooperated in a combined military operation against the empire. The Vijayanagara army at Talikota was large. The chronicles suggest several 100,000 soldiers, but it was poorly coordinated and its commander was killed early in the battle. 2 Muslim commanders who served in the Vijayanagara army defected to the Sultanate coalition during the battle, contributing to the rout of the imperial forces. The Emperor Aliya Rama Raya, who was at the time an old man of advanced years, was captured and beheaded, and his head was displayed on a pole by the victorious Sultanate forces. The demoralization of the Vijayanagara army and the death of its commander led to a complete collapse of resistance, and the coalition forces were able to advance without significant opposition to the capital. The destruction of Hampi that followed is described in both the Sultanate chronicles and in the accounts of the Portuguese traveler Cesare Federici, who visited the ruins shortly after the destruction. The chronicles describe a systematic campaign of demolition and looting that continued for several months, during which the temple sculptures were defaced, The royal buildings were burned, the bazaars were demolished, and the population was killed, enslaved, or dispersed. The specific extent of the destruction is visible in the Hampi ruins today. The royal palaces and administrative buildings are almost entirely reduced to their foundations, while the great stone temples survived because their massive granite construction made them too difficult to demolish completely. The accounts of foreign travelers who visited Hampi in the decades before the destruction of 1565 are among the most vivid and detailed descriptions of a major medieval Indian city surviving in any language, and they provide an essential complement to the physical evidence of the ruins. The Portuguese travelers Domingo Paes and Fernão Nunes, who visited Hampi in the 1520s and 1530s respectively, wrote accounts of the city that describe its size, its population, its markets, its festivals, and its royal court with a specificity and a vividness that no strictly Indian source of the period equals. The description by Cesare Federici of his visit to the ruins shortly after the destruction of 1565 provides a uniquely valuable perspective on the immediate aftermath of the catastrophe. Federici describes a city of immense size whose streets were empty, whose royal buildings were reduced to foundations, and whose temples still stood amid the ruins of the commercial and residential city. His account gives a sense of the speed and the completeness of the transformation from living city to ruin, and it confirms the specific pattern of destruction visible in the archaeological record. The stone structures survived, the wooden and plaster structures did not, and the population was entirely gone within months of the Sultanate forces' arrival. The specific question of whether the Battle of Talikota and the destruction of Hampi should be understood primarily as a religious conflict, as it was often framed by earlier historians who described it as a clash between Hindu civilization and Muslim power, or as a political and military contest between rival states that happened to have different religious affiliations, is one that contemporary scholarship has addressed with increasing nuance. The coalition that defeated Vijayanagara at Talikota was composed of Muslim sultanates, and the destruction of Hindu temples was one element of the campaign, but the political dynamics that drove the coalition were primarily territorial and economic rather than religious. Some Hindu states were allied with the sultanates at various points in the preceding conflicts, and some Muslim commanders served in the Vijayanagara army. The religious framing of the conflict, while not entirely without foundation, obscures the complex political reality of the Deccan in the 16th century. The aftermath of the destruction of Hampi saw a significant reorganization of political power across the Deccan, with the 5 Deccan sultanates that had formed the coalition against Vijayanagara quickly returning to their traditional mutual rivalries and conflicts. The alliance that had been so effectively employed against Vijayanagara did not survive the fall of its target, and within decades of the destruction of Hampi, the sultanates were again fighting among themselves, eventually to be incorporated into the expanding Mughal Empire from the north. The irony that the destruction of one of the great states of medieval India opened the way for the eventual Mughal domination of the Deccan is one of the recurring themes in the political history of the period. The religious landscape of Hampi, which encompasses not only the great temple complexes but the sacred topography of the boulder landscape itself, is one of the most complex and most layered religious environments in India, drawing on traditions that long predate the Vijayanagara period and that have continued to evolve since the empire's fall. The Hampi site is identified in the Hindu mythological tradition with Kishkinda, the monkey kingdom of the Ramayana, the epic poem that is one of the foundational texts of the Hindu tradition. The Tungabhadra Valley, with its boulder landscape and its forested hills, is described in the Ramayana as the home of the monkey king Sugriva and the location of the encounter between Sugriva and the hero Rama that is one of the pivotal episodes of the epic. The identification of the specific landscape features of the Hampi area with the mythological geography of the Ramayana, which scholars believe predates the Vijayanagara period and may reflect a much older sacred tradition associated with the site, gives Hampi a mythological depth that goes well beyond its imperial history. The Mathanga Hill, which rises above the Hampi site and provides views across the entire landscape, is one of the sacred hills of the Ramayana tradition and was an important site for religious practice in the Vijayanagara period. The Hemakuta Hill, directly south of the Virupaksha temple, is covered with dozens of small shrines and temples, many of them pre-Vijayanagara in date, that represent the accumulated religious investment of many centuries of worship at this sacred site. The specific density of the religious monuments on and around Hemakuta Hill, which includes Shaivite, Vaishnavite, and Jain structures from multiple periods, reflects the degree to which the Hampi site was already a major sacred center before the Vijayanagara rulers began their imperial building program. The river itself, the Tungabhadra, is sacred in the Hindu tradition, and the specific stretch of the river that flows past Hampi, with its natural rock formations and its pools and its islands, has been a place of pilgrimage and religious bathing for centuries before and after the Vijayanagara period. The coracle boats, the circular craft woven from bamboo and covered with hide, that have been used to cross the river at Hampi for centuries, are among the surviving elements of the specific river culture of the site that connects the present with the distant past. The archaeological evidence for pre-Vijayanagara occupation of the Hampi site is substantial, and it confirms that the site's sacred significance long predates the founding of the empire. Neolithic ash mounds in the Tungabhadra Valley, dated to the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE, document human occupation of the region in the prehistoric period. Early historic period pottery and inscriptions attest to settlement and religious activity at the site from at least the early centuries of the Common Era. The specific identification of the Hampi landscape with the Kishkinda of the Ramayana may reflect the incorporation of an already ancient sacred tradition into the epic narrative, giving the site a mythological depth that the Vijayanagara rulers were consciously exploiting when they chose it as their capital. The specific tradition of Shaivite worship associated with the Virupaksha deity at Hampi is documented in inscriptions and literary texts from the Chalukya and Hosla periods, several centuries before the founding of the Vijayanagara Empire, and the temple complex that the Vijayanagara rulers expanded so dramatically was built on the foundations of an older shrine whose origins are not fully documented but appear to predate the empire by many centuries. The continuous thread of worship at the Virupaksha temple, from the pre-Vijayanagara period through the empire's height and the destruction of 1565 and the 5 subsequent centuries of reduced but uninterrupted religious activity, is one of the most remarkable stories of institutional continuity in the history of South Asian religious life. The Anjanyadri Hill, which rises above the Tungabhadra Valley to the north of Hampi and which is identified in the local tradition as the birthplace of Hanuman, the monkey god who is one of the central figures of the Ramayana, is one of the most important pilgrimage sites in the Hampi landscape. The climb to the summit of Anjanyadri Hill, which involves ascending several hundred steps carved into the rock face, is one of the standard elements of the Hampi pilgrimage, and the views from the summit across the Tungabhadra Valley and the Hampi landscape below illuminate the specific geographic character of the site that the Ramayana identification exploits. Looking out from Anjanyadri Hill across the boulder landscape, with the river visible below and the temple towers of Hampi in the middle distance, it is possible to understand why a tradition would identify this landscape with the monkey kingdom of the epic. There is a quality of the place that is both wild and sacred in a way that the mythological tradition captures effectively. The annual festivals at the Virupaksha temple, which draw hundreds of thousands of pilgrims from across Karnataka and the neighboring states, are one of the most spectacular expressions of the continuing sacred vitality of the Hampi site. The Chariot Festival, in which the image of the Virupaksha deity is installed in a large wooden chariot and drawn through the streets by devotees, is an event of considerable scale and devotional intensity that has been performed at this site for many centuries, connecting the modern festival community to the ceremonial traditions of the Vijayanagara period. The specific history of how Hampi was rediscovered by the modern world, and how it came to be recognized as one of the great archaeological sites of South Asia, is a story that involves both the British colonial archaeology of the 19th century and the continuing work of Indian scholars who have transformed the understanding of the site in the decades since independence. The site was never entirely lost in the way that sites like Angkor or Machu Picchu were lost, because the Virupaksha temple maintained its continuous function as a place of active worship throughout the centuries following the destruction of the city, and the local communities of the Hampi area maintained the tradition of the site's sacred and historical significance. but the scholarly and systematic investigation of the site, and the broader recognition of its historical importance, was the product of the 19th century colonial encounter between the British administration and the Indian past. Colin Mackenzie, who later became the first Surveyor General of India, conducted the first systematic survey of the Hampi site in 1800, documenting the visible ruins and collecting inscriptions and manuscripts that provided the first scholarly framework for understanding the site's history. Subsequent archaeological surveys in the 19th and early 20th centuries expanded the documentation of the site and began the process of interpretation that would eventually produce the comprehensive understanding of Vijayanagara history that contemporary scholarship reflects. The designation of Hampi as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1986 brought international recognition of the site's significance, and with it both increased resources for conservation and increased pressure from tourism and development. The specific conservation challenges at Hampi are significant. The site is both an active religious center, with the Virupaksha temple functioning as a living temple in the middle of the archaeological zone, and a major tourist destination, with the visitor numbers that create both economic opportunities and conservation threats. The management of the tension between these different stakeholder interests, in a site where ancient monuments, active religious practice, and modern tourism coexist in close proximity, is one of the ongoing challenges of Hampi's stewardship. The specific challenges of conserving granite temple architecture in a tropical climate are different from those faced by the more familiar stone monuments of the Mediterranean and the temperate world, and the conservation programs at Hampi have had to develop specific approaches to the problems of biological growth, moisture penetration, and structural instability that affect the surviving monuments. The tropical vegetation that grows aggressively in the Hampi climate, including the banyan trees whose roots penetrate the stone and the grasses and mosses that accelerate the weathering of the carved surfaces, requires constant management if the integrity of the ancient fabric is to be maintained. The question of the appropriate treatment of the active religious sites within the World Heritage Zone, where the needs of continuing religious practice sometimes conflict with the requirements of archaeological conservation, is one that has no simple answer and that requires ongoing negotiation between the conservation authorities and the religious communities who have historical rights to the use of these spaces. The specific interventions of modern temple management at the Virupaksha temple, which has seen the construction of new buildings and facilities for pilgrims within the ancient temple complex, have been a source of tension between the conservation priorities of the World Heritage Management Framework and the religious priorities of the temple administration. The inscriptions at the Virupaksha temple document the continuous history of the institution from the Chalukya period through the Vijayanagara period and beyond, and they provide one of the most complete records of a South Indian temple institution's history available anywhere in the subcontinent. The specific details of the temple's economic history, including the grants of land and revenue that supported its operations, the donations of precious metals and jewels that enriched its treasury, and the employment of large numbers of musicians, dancers, priests, and administrative staff, paint a picture of the temple as a major economic institution as well as a religious one. The relationship between the Archaeological Survey of India and the temple administration at the Virupaksha temple has been a continuing source of complexity in the management of the Hampi site, because the temple is under the management of the Hindu Religious and Charitable Endowments Department of the Karnataka state government rather than under the authority of the Archaeological Survey. The coexistence of two different government agencies with different mandates and different priorities in the same site creates administrative challenges that have not always been resolved in ways that satisfy either the conservation requirements of the World Heritage designation or the religious requirements of the temple community. The royal enclosure of Hampi, the walled precinct at the center of the city that housed the palaces, audience halls, and administrative buildings of the Vijayanagara kings, is the area of the site that most directly reflects the imperial character of the city and the specific form of power that the Vijayanagara state exercised. The Mahanavami Dibba, also known as the platform of the royal throne, is a three-tiered stepped platform approximately 12 meters high whose decorated walls are covered with elaborate bas-relief panels showing scenes of royal ceremony, hunting, and festivity. The platform was the focus of the Mahanavami festival, the 10-day celebration that was the most important royal ceremony of the Vijayanagara year, during which the king received tribute from his vassal lords, reviewed his armies and elephants, and presided over athletic competitions and theatrical performances. The account of the Mahanavami festival by the Portuguese traveler Domingo Paes is one of the most vivid descriptions of a medieval South Asian royal ceremony surviving in any language, and it gives a specific and detailed picture of the ceremonial life of the Vijayanagara court at the height of its power. The Hazara Rama temple within the royal enclosure, whose walls are covered with an extraordinarily complete narrative frieze depicting the story of the Ramayana, served as the private chapel of the Vijayanagara kings and as the ceremonial center for the royal observances of the Mahanavami festival. The quality and completeness of the Ramayana narrative on the Hazara Rama walls makes it one of the most important works of narrative sculpture in the Indian tradition, and the specific details of the sculptural program, which show the influence of court painters and literary traditions in addition to the conventional sculptural vocabulary of the Dravidian tradition, reflect the specific sophistication of the Vijayanagara artistic world at its height. The audience hall within the royal enclosure, whose raised platform and column structure reflect the specific protocol of Vijayanagara royal ceremony, was the space where the king received foreign envoys, administered justice, and conducted the public functions of the imperial government. The scale of the audience hall, which could accommodate hundreds of participants in the royal ceremonies, reflects the imperial ambition of the Vijayanagara state and the specific importance attached to the public performance of royal authority in the political culture of the empire. The specific design of the royal enclosure, with its multiple gateways, its watchtowers, and its carefully organized interior spaces, reflects the specific protocol of Vijayanagara royal ceremony and the importance attached to the management of access and visibility in the imperial political culture. The sequence of spaces through which a visitor or supplicant passed in approaching the king's presence, moving from the public areas of the outer enclosure through progressively more restricted spaces toward the private apartments of the inner palace, was itself a form of political theater that communicated the hierarchy of the court and the specific distance between the king and those who sought his attention. The specific relationship between the royal enclosure at Hampi and the major temple complexes of the city reflects the Vijayanagara understanding of the relationship between royal and divine authority. The king's palace was positioned in deliberate proximity to the major temples, and the ceremonial routes that connected the royal enclosure to the temple complexes were the physical expression of the theological claim that the king was the deputy of the deity and the instrument of divine will in the world. The specific iconography of the Vijayanagara kings in their temple donations, which often portrayed them in the posture and with the attributes of divine figures, reinforced this theological claim and gave the royal authority a sacred dimension that went beyond the merely political. The Vijayanagara ruler's relationship with the Virupaksh deity was not merely symbolic but was expressed through specific ritual obligations and ceremonial practices that structured the daily and annual life of the court. The daily rituals of the Virupaksh temple, in which the king participated through his representatives if not in person, connected the royal function to the divine order in a way that the theological tradition understood as essential to the proper functioning of the kingdom. The specific rituals of the Mahanavami festival, in which the king renewed his relationship with the divine order through a 10-day sequence of ceremonies, were the most public expression of this theological connection between royal and divine authority. The concept of the king as the protector of the Dharma, the sacred order that sustains the world, was central to the Vijayanagara royal ideology and explains the specific emphasis on temple building and religious patronage that characterizes the empire's cultural program. For the Vijayanagara rulers, the construction of temples was not simply an act of personal piety or political display, but a fulfillment of the royal obligation to maintain the conditions under which the sacred order of the world could be properly sustained. This theological framework gave the imperial building program at Hampi a coherence and a purpose that went beyond the merely aesthetic and that is visible in the specific choices made in the design and iconographic programs of the major temple complexes. The literature and artistic traditions that flourished in Hampi under the patronage of the Vijayanagara rulers represent one of the great cultural efflorescences of medieval South Asia, and the specific achievements of Vijayanagara culture in music, dance, poetry, and the visual arts are an important dimension of the site's significance that the ruins alone cannot fully communicate. The reign of Krishna-dev-Raya, who ruled from 1509 to 1529, is widely regarded as the golden age of Vijayanagara culture, and Krishna-dev-Raya himself was a significant literary figure who composed the Telugu epic Amukta as well as works in Sanskrit and Kannada. The 8 poets known as the Ashtadiggajs, the 8 elephants of the literary compass, who adorned his court are celebrated in the Telugu literary tradition as the greatest poets of the classical period, and the specific combination of royal patronage and native literary genius that characterized the Krishna-dev-Raya court produced a flowering of Telugu literature whose influence on the subsequent tradition was enormous. The music and dance traditions of the Vijayanagara period are documented both in the literary sources and in the sculptural programs of the Hampi temples, whose carved reliefs showing musicians and dancers provide visual evidence for the specific forms of performance that were practiced at the court and in the temples. The Carnatic classical music tradition of South India, one of the 2 great classical music traditions of the Indian subcontinent, was significantly shaped by the musical patronage of the Vijayanagara rulers, and several of the most important figures in the founding of the Carnatic tradition were active during the Vijayanagara period or in the cultural world of its successor states. The specific relationship between the royal court at Hampi and the broader cultural world of South Asia in the 15th and 16th centuries illuminates both the cosmopolitan character of the Vijayanagara state and the specific flows of artistic and intellectual influence that made medieval India one of the most culturally productive regions of the world. Persian and Arabic literary conventions influenced the Telugu and Kannada poetry of the period. Islamic architectural forms were absorbed into the Vijayanagara building tradition. The horse trade with the Persian Gulf brought not only animals but also artistic and cultural influences from the Persianate world into the specific cultural environment of the South Indian Empire. The visual arts of the Vijayanagara period, including the wall paintings that survive in a few temples of the region and the manuscript illustrations that have been preserved in libraries in India and Europe, add a dimension to the understanding of Vijayanagara visual culture that the surviving sculptural tradition alone cannot provide. The Lepakshi temple murals, painted in a style that reflects both the South Indian mural tradition and the specific aesthetic preferences of the Vijayanagara court, are among the most complete surviving examples of medieval South Indian wall painting and give a vivid picture of the visual world of the period. The Telugu literary tradition that flourished under Vijayanagara patronage continues to be a living and productive tradition in the Telugu-speaking world today, and the specific works produced under Krishna-dev-Raya's patronage are still read and celebrated as classics of the language. The Ashtadiggajs, the 8 court poets whose works are the most celebrated products of the Krishna-dev-Raya court, wrote in a tradition of Telugu poetry that combines Sanskrit learning with vernacular sensibility in a way that shaped the subsequent development of the language and literature for centuries. The specific achievement of the Vijayanagara literary patronage was to establish Telugu as a major literary language with a classical canon of its own, comparable in its scope and sophistication to the Sanskrit tradition that had previously dominated the learned culture of the region. The music theory and compositional practice of the Carnatic tradition, which the Vijayanagara period did so much to shape, continues to be one of the most sophisticated musical systems in the world today, with a repertoire of compositions, a system of ragas and talas, and a performance practice that have developed continuously from the Vijayanagara period to the present. The specific contribution of the Vijayanagara court to this tradition was not only through patronage but through the active participation of the rulers themselves in musical life, and several of the most important early composers of the Carnatic tradition are recorded as having been active at or around the Vijayanagara court. The relationship between the Vijayanagara cultural achievement and the subsequent development of South Indian culture is one of the more significant dimensions of the empire's historical legacy. The specific literary, musical, and architectural traditions that the empire developed and patronized did not disappear with the fall of Hampi but continued to develop in the successor states and the regional traditions of Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, and Tamil Nadu. The Hampi ruins are therefore not just a memorial to a lost civilization, but a visible marker of the origins of living cultural traditions that remain active and productive in the South Indian world of the present day. The relationship between the Hampi ruins and the living communities of the surrounding area is one of the most complex dimensions of the site's contemporary management, because the site is not simply an archaeological preserve but an inhabited landscape with communities whose presence both enriches and complicates the conservation of the ancient remains. The village of Hampi, which occupies the area immediately around the Virupaksha temple, has been an inhabited settlement since at least the medieval period, and the specific community that lives there, composed primarily of priests, pilgrims, and those who serve the religious and tourist economy of the site, has a relationship with the ancient monuments that is both intimate and complex. The priests of the Virupaksha temple are the custodians of a religious tradition that has been maintained at this site for more than 1,500 years, and their presence gives the temple complex a living quality that archaeological sites without active religious functions cannot replicate. The broader landscape of the Hampi area is also inhabited by farming communities whose ancestors lived in the region during the Vijayanagara period, and whose relationship with the ancient landscape is expressed through the network of sacred sites, pilgrimage routes, and traditional practices that connect the present communities to the deep history of the place. The specific archaeological management of Hampi requires negotiation with these communities about the appropriate balance between conservation imperatives and the continuing use of the landscape for agricultural and religious purposes. The tourism economy that has developed around Hampi since the UNESCO World Heritage designation has brought both economic opportunity and significant conservation challenges. The development of hotels, restaurants, and tourist infrastructure in and around the archaeological zone has been a source of ongoing tension between the conservation authorities and the local economy, and the specific question of how to accommodate the large numbers of visitors that Hampi attracts while protecting the fragile ancient remains from the physical impact of tourism is one that the site's managers have been grappling with for decades. The archaeological survey work conducted at Hampi over the past several decades has significantly expanded the known extent of the ancient city, revealing that the urban fabric of the Vijayanagara capital extended considerably beyond the area of the major monuments that have traditionally defined the site in tourist itineraries. The systematic mapping of the urban core using satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and traditional survey methods has produced a more complete picture of the ancient street plan, the distribution of residential and commercial areas, and the extent of the water management infrastructure than was previously available. The specific challenge of managing a site whose significance extends across a landscape of 26 square kilometers, rather than being concentrated in a single monument or a small cluster of monuments, requires a planning approach that goes beyond the conventional management of individual heritage structures. The Hampi World Heritage Management Plan, developed by the Archaeological Survey of India and the Karnataka state government, attempts to address this challenge by establishing a system of zones with different levels of protection and different management protocols. But the implementation of the plan across a landscape that encompasses multiple jurisdictions and stakeholders has been an ongoing challenge. The buffer zone of the Hampi World Heritage Site extends well beyond the core archaeological zone to encompass the wider landscape that gives the core zone its visual and environmental context, and the management of development pressures within the buffer zone has been one of the most contentious issues in Hampi's recent heritage management history. The construction of hotels, resorts, and tourist facilities in the buffer zone landscape has been a source of tension between heritage conservation priorities and the economic development aspirations of the local communities and the regional government, and the specific resolution of this tension in different areas of the buffer zone has produced uneven results from a conservation perspective. The International Council on Monuments and Sites has placed Hampi on its list of most threatened heritage sites on several occasions, citing the encroachment of development on the visual setting of the monuments and the inadequacy of the conservation and management infrastructure relative to the scale and complexity of the site. The specific recommendations of the international monitoring bodies, which have called for more rigorous control of development within the buffer zone and for better coordination between the different government agencies responsible for the site's management, have been implemented with varying degrees of effectiveness over the years. The inscriptional record of the Vijayanagara Empire, which is one of the most extensive epigraphic corpora of any medieval Indian state, provides a detailed picture of the administrative, religious, and commercial life of the empire that complements the architectural and artistic evidence of the Hampi ruins. The inscriptions of the Vijayanagara period, carved on the walls and bases of temples throughout the empire, record royal grants of land and revenue to temple establishments, donations by merchants and nobles to religious institutions, administrative regulations governing markets and commercial activities, and the names and achievements of kings and their officials. The specific content of these inscriptions, analyzed by epigraphers working in Sanskrit, Telugu, Kannada, and Tamil, has produced a detailed picture of the economic and administrative organization of the Vijayanagara state that the physical remains of the city alone could not provide. The merchant communities documented in the Vijayanagara inscriptions were organized in specific trade guilds that operated across regional boundaries and that maintained their own legal systems and social hierarchies. The Chetty merchants, who were prominent in the long-distance trade of the empire, are documented in inscriptions from Hampi and from temple sites across the length and breadth of the Vijayanagara territory, showing the geographic reach of the commercial networks that flowed through the capital. The specific relationship between the merchant guilds and the temple institutions, which were major economic actors in the Vijayanagara system, is one of the more productive areas of recent scholarship on the empire's economic history. The inscriptions also document the specific multi-religious character of the Vijayanagara state in a concrete way, recording donations by Shaivite, Vaishnavite, and Jain communities alongside each other and showing the specific mechanisms through which the empire managed its diverse religious constituencies. The temple institutions that received royal grants and merchant donations were not only religious centers but economic actors, employing large numbers of craftspeople, musicians, dancers, and agricultural laborers and managing significant land endowments on behalf of the deity in whose name they were established. The specific role of the Devadasi tradition in the Vijayanagara temple economy is documented in the inscriptions and in the traveler accounts, which describe large numbers of women attached to the major temples as dancers and singers and as participants in the ritual life of the temple establishment. The Devadasi tradition, which was a formal institution in which women were dedicated to the service of a specific deity and maintained by the economic resources of the temple, was one of the major channels through which the Vijayanagara state invested in the performance arts of music and dance that were central to the temple ritual. The specific relationship between the Devadasi institution, the development of the classical South Indian dance traditions, and the broader political economy of the Vijayanagara temple system is one of the more complex and contested areas of Vijayanagara studies. The specific content of the Vijayanagara temple inscriptions provides a window into the economic life of the city that complements the archaeological and documentary evidence in important ways. The records of land grants, merchant donations, and commercial regulations that are preserved in the inscriptions allow economic historians to reconstruct specific aspects of the Vijayanagara economy with a precision that would not be possible from the literary sources alone. The specific prices recorded in some of the commercial regulation inscriptions, for example, provide direct evidence for the relative values of different commodities in the Hampi market and for the specific mechanisms of price regulation that the state employed in managing the commercial life of its capital. The broader economic history of the Vijayanagara period, as reconstructed from the inscriptions, the traveler accounts, and the archaeological evidence, reveals a sophisticated commercial economy that was integrated into the wider Indian Ocean trading system and that produced significant wealth for both the state and the merchant communities that operated within its framework. The specific mechanisms of this integration, including the port facilities on the Malabar and Coromandel coasts that connected Hampi to the maritime trade routes of the Indian Ocean world, the overland trade routes that connected the capital to the interior markets of the subcontinent, and the specific role of the state in regulating and taxing commercial activity, are documented in the inscriptional record in considerable detail. The numismatic evidence from Hampi and the wider Vijayanagara territory, including the gold coins, silver coins, and copper coins that were the media of exchange in different segments of the market, provides additional evidence for the commercial sophistication of the empire. The Vijayanagara gold coinage, known as the Varha, was one of the most widely used currencies in medieval South Asia and was accepted in commercial transactions across a vast geographic area extending well beyond the political boundaries of the empire. The specific iconography of the Vijayanagara coins, which featured both Hindu deities and royal imagery, reflected the theological dimensions of Vijayanagara royal authority and communicated the imperial ideology in a medium that circulated throughout the commercial networks of the empire and beyond. The fate of the population of Hampi after the destruction of 1565 is one of the questions that the historical sources address only partially, but the evidence that exists paints a picture of dispersal and survival rather than complete annihilation, with the traditions and craft skills of the Vijayanagara culture continuing in the successor states and communities that emerged from the wreckage of the empire. The emperor who survived the Battle of Talikota, Tirumala Devaraya, re-established the Vijayanagara court at Penyakanda, further south in the Karnataka interior, and the empire continued for another century in a weakened form before finally dissolving into regional successor states in the mid-17th century. The administrative and cultural traditions of the Vijayanagara court were maintained in these successor states, and many of the craft traditions, the architectural styles, and the literary and musical traditions of the Vijayanagara period continued to develop in the new political contexts. The artisans and craftspeople who had worked in the workshops of Hampi, carving the temple sculptures and building the palace structures and weaving the textiles that filled the bazaars, were dispersed across the Deccan and the Tamil country, carrying their skills to new patrons in the courts of the successor states. The specific sculptural style of the late Vijayanagara period can be traced in temple complexes across Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh that were built in the century following the fall of Hampi, documenting the geographic dispersal of the artistic tradition through the movement of its practitioners. The priestly communities who maintained the temples at Hampi continued their functions after the destruction of the city, maintaining the sacred fires and the ritual observances of the major temples even as the imperial city around them disappeared. The continuous thread of worship at the Virupaksh temple, which has never been interrupted since its establishment in the medieval period, is the most visible surviving expression of this continuity, but the broader network of sacred sites in the Hampi landscape has similarly been maintained by local communities across the centuries since the empire's fall. The specific question of what the destruction of Hampi meant for the communities that survived it, and how those communities understood and responded to the experience of imperial collapse, is one that historians have approached from several different angles. The literary sources of the period after 1565, including the Telugu and Kannada poetry and the Sanskrit chronicles that record the disaster, show a range of responses from lamentation and despair to resilience and reconstruction, and the specific form of these responses illuminates the way in which the Vijayanagara cultural tradition processed the experience of catastrophic loss. The material culture of the post-destruction period, including the ceramics and the art objects produced in the successor states and the communities that maintained the Vijayanagara traditions after the fall of the capital, shows both the continuity of the Vijayanagara artistic tradition and the specific adaptations that the tradition underwent in its new contexts. The temple complexes built in Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh in the century following the fall of Hampi, which were often built by the same craftspeople who had worked in the Hampi workshops, represent the continuation of the Vijayanagara architectural and sculptural tradition in new political environments and with new patrons, documenting the resilience of the cultural tradition even as the political structure that had originally supported it was gone. The specific experience of the people who were present at the destruction of Hampi, whether as inhabitants of the city, as members of the attacking forces, or as survivors who returned to the ruins afterward, is something that the surviving sources address only obliquely. The humanizing details, the specific individual experiences of terror and loss and survival that must have characterized the days and weeks of the destruction campaign, are almost entirely absent from the chronicles, which record the destruction in terms of political and military outcomes rather than human suffering. The physical evidence of the destruction is more immediate. The broken sculptures in the temple enclosures, whose damage is specifically patterned in a way that suggests deliberate iconoclasm rather than random vandalism, document the systematic character of the campaign against the Hindu religious monuments. The fire-damaged building materials found in the archaeological excavation of the palace areas document the burning of the royal buildings. The complete absence of portable valuables from the excavated deposits, in marked contrast to the rich artifact assemblages that would be expected from a functioning city of this size and wealth, documents the thoroughness of the looting. The physical record of the destruction, read alongside the chronicle accounts, produces a picture of a systematic and deliberate campaign that was not a side effect of battle but a specific military objective carried out over months. The archaeological investigation of Hampi over the past century has transformed the understanding of the site from a collection of impressive ruins into a comprehensive picture of a functioning medieval city. And the specific methods and discoveries of this investigation illuminate both the achievements of Vijayanagara civilization and the limitations of what archaeology can recover from a site that was deliberately destroyed. The Archaeological Survey of India has maintained a continuous presence at Hampi since the late 19th century, and the accumulated work of generations of archaeologists has produced both the conservation of the standing monuments and the excavation of buried areas that has revealed the specific character of the urban fabric of the ancient city. The excavation of the urban core of the city in the Vijayanagara Research Project, which was carried out in the 1980s and 1990s, produced a detailed picture of the street plan, the building types, and the artifact assemblages of the late Vijayanagara city in the decades before its destruction. The specific findings of the Vijayanagara Research Project include detailed documentation of the bazaar streets that led from the major temple complexes, the residential areas that housed different communities of the city's population, the water management infrastructure, and the craft production areas where the goods sold in the markets were manufactured. The artifact assemblages from the excavations, which include ceramics, metal objects, and the debris of craft production, provide evidence for the specific economic activities of the city that the inscriptional and literary sources document in more general terms. The continuing use of the Hampi landscape for agriculture and habitation since the fall of the city has both preserved some aspects of the ancient landscape, through the maintenance of traditional water management features, and damaged others, through the clearance of archaeological deposits and the construction of modern buildings on ancient foundations. The management of this tension between the living landscape and the archaeological remains is one of the central challenges of Hampi's conservation, and the development of appropriate frameworks for managing it is one of the ongoing concerns of the site's archaeological and conservation community. The specific technology of the Vijayanagara builders, and particularly their mastery of granite construction, is one of the more impressive aspects of the site's architectural achievement. Granite is one of the most difficult stones to work, resistant to the chisels and saws that are adequate for softer stones like limestone and sandstone, and the specific techniques developed by the Vijayanagara craftsmen for quarrying, transporting, and carving the granite of the Tungabhadra Valley represent a significant body of practical knowledge and technical skill. The specific methods used to produce the extremely fine sculptural detail visible on the best Vijayanagara carvings, which rivals the quality of carving in softer stones, required tools and techniques adapted specifically to the properties of the local stone. The laser scanning and photogrammetric documentation of the Hampi monuments, carried out in recent years by the Archaeological Survey of India and by international research teams, has produced digital records of the site's architecture and sculpture at a level of detail that was previously impossible to achieve and that will serve as a permanent record of the site's condition regardless of any future deterioration. The specific value of this digital documentation is not only for conservation monitoring but for scholarly study, allowing researchers to examine the details of inscriptions and sculptural programs from locations around the world without requiring access to the physical site. The specific study of the Hampi inscriptions by epigraphers working in multiple South Asian languages has been one of the most productive areas of Vijayanagara scholarship over the past century, and the corpus of inscriptions from Hampi and the surrounding region is one of the most important sources for the political, administrative, economic, and social history of medieval South India. The inscriptions record not only the expected content of royal proclamations and religious donations, but also a range of more quotidian matters including market regulations, property disputes, and the specific terms of employment agreements, giving historians access to aspects of Vijayanagara social life that literary sources do not address. The architectural studies of the Hampi monuments, which have been carried out by Indian and international scholars working in the tradition of art history and architectural history, have produced a detailed understanding of the development of the Vijayanagara building tradition, from its roots in the earlier South Indian architectural traditions to its mature expression in the great temple complexes of the 15th and 16th centuries. The specific analysis of the stylistic and technical evolution of the Vijayanagara architectural tradition across the different phases of construction visible at Hampi has produced a more precise chronology of the site's development and a better understanding of the specific artistic choices that the Vijayanagara builders made at different points in the history of the capital. The experience of visiting Hampi, which is one of the most popular tourist destinations in India and a site that has attracted Western backpackers, Indian pilgrims, and international art historians in roughly equal measure for the past 3 decades, is shaped by the specific qualities of the site itself, its combination of monumental architecture, sacred landscape, and natural beauty, and by the specific challenges of navigating a site that extends across 26 square kilometers of complex and often difficult terrain. The conventional approach to the Hampi site from the town of Hosapete, which is the nearest major transport hub, brings the visitor into the site from the west, approaching the Virupaksh temple through the bazaar street that leads to its main Gopuram. The first site of the Gopuram, rising 50 meters above the street in the warm light of a South Indian morning, establishes the specific register of Hampi's architectural experience. The scale of the monuments is not the most immediately striking thing about them, because the horizontal spread of the site and the surrounding landscape of boulders moderate the visual impact of any single structure. But the quality of the stone carving and the density of the sculptural program communicates an attention to craft and detail that accumulates over the course of a visit into a powerful impression of artistic ambition and technical mastery. The Hampi Bazaar, which extends for several hundred meters from the main Gopuram of the Virupaksh temple, gives an idea of the scale and the organization of the commercial center of the ancient city. Though the modern buildings that line it have replaced the ancient structures, and the specific character of the medieval bazaar can be understood only through the imagination and the documentary record rather than through direct observation of surviving structures. The transition from the active religious center of the Virupaksh temple to the archaeological landscape of the rest of the site, where the ruins are protected as World Heritage monuments and visitors move through them on established paths, is one of the more interesting experiences of the Hampi visit, because it makes visible the coexistence of different regimes of heritage management within the same site. The view from the Mathanga hill, which can be reached by a short climb up the boulder-strewn path from the base of the hill, provides one of the most comprehensive perspectives on the Hampi landscape available from ground level. From the summit, the full extent of the ruined city spreads in every direction, with the towers of the major temples visible above the tree line, the Tungabhadra visible as a silver curve through the boulder landscape, and the agricultural fields that have reclaimed much of the ancient urban area laid out in the middle distance. The specific quality of the Hampi light in the early morning, before the heat of the day has become oppressive, gives the entire landscape a quality of clarity and color that makes the views from Mathanga Hill one of the memorable experiences of South India. The experience of Hampi at sunset, when the light turns the granite boulders from gray to gold and the shadows of the temple Gopurams lengthen across the landscape and the sound of bells from the Virupaksh temple carries across the still evening air, is one that many visitors describe as among the most affecting of their experience in India. There is a specific quality of the South Indian evening light that Hampi's landscape seems to have been designed, or perhaps has evolved, to catch most effectively. The warm orange of the granite and the cooler gray of the carved stone and the dark green of the vegetation and the silver of the river below all responding to the same light in different ways, creating a visual environment of unusual richness and variety. The pilgrims who come to Hampi from across India, often in large family groups that include multiple generations, experience the site very differently from the Western backpackers and art historians who make up much of the non-Indian visitor population. For the pilgrims, the priority is the Virupaksha temple and the other active sacred sites, and the experience of darshan, the auspicious viewing of the deity, is the primary purpose of the visit. The archaeological ruins are secondary, though often appreciated as evidence of the glory of the civilization that built the temples they have come to worship in. This difference in visitor motivation and visitor experience is one of the aspects of Hampi's complexity that makes it one of the most interesting heritage sites in India from a management perspective. Hampi stands in its boulder landscape above the Tungabhadra River, the great temples still rising above the tree line, the carved surfaces of the gopurams still carrying their hundreds of figures in the Vijayanagara sculptural tradition, the river still moving through the rock pools below, the light still changing across the granite surfaces through the hours of the day, as it has for 500 years of ruin and 500 more of imperial glory before that. The city that was here was real. The people who built it had names and histories and specific ideas about beauty and devotion and power, and they expressed those ideas in the largest and most elaborate temple complexes of southern India, in the poetry they wrote and the music they played and the paintings they made, and in the commercial networks that brought horses from Arabia and diamonds from the Deccan mines and spices from the Malabar coast through the markets of their capital. The city was one of the largest on earth, and it was destroyed in a single campaign, and it was never rebuilt. The destruction of Hampi was a specific historical event with specific causes and specific actors, and it is worth insisting on that specificity against the tendency to make it a symbol of the general fragility of human achievement. The 5 Deccan sultanates that destroyed the city had specific political and military reasons for doing so, and the campaign of destruction they carried out was as systematic and deliberate as the construction of the city had been. The temples survived not because they were preserved by some general force of historical conservation, but because their granite construction made them too difficult to demolish quickly. The palaces burned because they were built of wood and plaster. The bazaars were demolished because their goods were portable and their structures were not worth maintaining. The city disappeared because there was no one left to inhabit it and no political power with the interest and the capacity to rebuild it. What remains is enough. The Vittala temple and its musical pillars. The Hazara Rama and its Ramayana friezes. The Virupaksha temple and its 15 centuries of uninterrupted worship. The Queen's Bath with its arched verandas. The elephant stables with their alternating domes. The stepped tanks and the ruined aqueducts. The boulders. The river. The light. Hampi asks us to hold 2 things simultaneously: the greatness of what was built here and the completeness of its destruction. Not to resolve the tension between those 2 facts, but to sit with it, as the pilgrims have always sat with it, in the shade of a temple wall at the edge of the Tungabhadra, listening to the river move through the rocks. The specific act of attention that Hampi invites is one of the most valuable things a heritage site can offer. The slowing down of habitual perception into something more receptive, more willing to be surprised by the weight of what has happened in a place and the persistence of what remains. The Vittala temple pillars that produce musical tones when struck have been doing so for 5 centuries. The Virupaksha temple has received worshippers for 15 centuries. The boulders have been here for millions of years before the first temple was built or the first humans set foot in the valley. Hampi places human time within a longer frame, and the experience of that placement, achieved not through abstract reflection but through the specific sensory encounter with the stones and the river and the light, is what makes the site something more than an impressive collection of ruins. The persistence of the Hampi landscape through 5 centuries of ruin is itself a form of evidence about the character of the civilization that created it. The temples survive because they were built to last, with the same attention to quality and the same investment in craft skill that produced the elaborate sculptural programs on their walls. The water management features survive in residual form because they were integrated into the natural hydraulics of the landscape in a way that outlasted the imperial political system that originally organized them. and the sacred geography of the site, the identification of specific boulders and hills and river bends with the mythological landscape of the Ramayana, survives in the living tradition of the pilgrimage community that has maintained its connection to the place through every political transformation of the past 2,000 years. Hampi is a ruin, but it is a ruin with roots that go deeper than the empire that is visible in its stones. And it is a ruin that remains, in a specific and important sense, alive, because the sacred traditions that animated the Vijayanagara building program are still being practiced at the Virupaksha temple and at the other active religious sites of the Hampi landscape, connecting the modern devotional community to the same divine presences that the Vijayanagara kings and merchants and craftspeople and ordinary citizens engaged with at the same sites 500 years ago. The ruins are not all that remains. What remains also includes the tradition of engagement with the sacred that the ruins express. And what remains, finally, is the landscape itself, the boulders and the river and the light, which will still be here when all the temples have finally crumbled and all the traveler accounts have been forgotten and all the arguments about history have been set aside. The Tungabhadra moves through its rock pools. The granite holds the heat of the afternoon. And the day ends, as it has always ended in this valley, in colors that the language of ruins cannot quite capture. If this documentary has kept you company through the night, consider subscribing so you never miss the next quiet journey. And if you are ready for another story from the ancient world, there is one waiting for you on the screen now.